Joining me now, someone who has followed this data and science since day one. Phil Kerpen is the president of American Commitment, and he joins me now. Phil, good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Great to be with you, Dana.
So I was following you on social media earlier as there was, because I know Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida was getting a lot of heat. He came out, there was another video of him that came out today and was saying, parents, use your best judgment about masking your children. You were sharing some very interesting data as well about kids and masks and schools, these mask mandates that were saying that either students have to have them, staff has to have them. You had shared a piece that was saying that the data that we have actually shows higher cases of contraction of this virus than without the mask mandates. Talk to us a little bit about that, because at first glance you would think that kind of just flies in the face of, well, it's to prevent the virus, but it actually, with kids, kids aren't really the carriers. Schools have never been hotspots.
Well, we've got the data's kind of all over the map with this, Dana, and I'm not sure we can conclude necessarily that the schools that don't mask children have lower case rates, although that is what some of the data sets show. But the really interesting thing to me is that every single source, no matter which one you look at, just shows microscopic case rates among children, and in particular shows that they're not drivers of the epidemic and never have been. And that's especially significant now when, even if they were spreading it, all of the adults have been offered vaccination if they want it. And so, the CDC, if you look on their Science Brief website, where they try to justify their recommendation for masking children in schools, they've got about 4 or 5 studies that are completely irrelevant to that question, because they just look at schools where there were masks and say there was very low case rate. But there probably would have been a very low case rate without the masks. Unless you're comparing masked to unmasked, it doesn't really tell you anything about masks. The one citation that they have that does that compares masked to unmasked, is from the first semester last year in Florida, where the case rates were very low in all of the schools, but they were slightly higher in the schools that did not mask. And you might think, oh, well, that must mean something, that must prove something, except if you look at the whole year, if you look at the second semester and you add it in, the opposite is true. In the full year data in Florida, the schools that did not mask had lower case rates than the ones that did. And so I'm not sure it makes much of a difference either way. The only study the CDC has was that first semester one. Second semester had the exact opposite result. And frankly, if you believe CDC, here's the other thing that's so remarkable. If you believe CDC, 40% of school-age kids somehow were exposed to this virus by the end of March. That's their burden estimate. So they had very low case rates. They weren't getting in school. They weren't, by and large, getting sick. They didn't even know they had it. But CDC wants us to believe that 40% of them had it by March, which means half of all school-age kids probably had it by now, which means whatever we were doing didn't prevent them from getting it. The reason they had so few hospitalizations and deaths is that being a child is protective, not because of anything we did to them.
Oh, that's a very good point, because they're just not physically mature enough to be able, as I understand it, it has to do with like receptors in your respiratory system, et cetera.
There are a lot of theories as to why, but the point that I've been making is, if you believe the CDC number that 40% of kids had already had it by March, then anything and everything we did to prevent them from getting infections was a total waste, because they got the infections, they just didn't get sick.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. What do you make of, and I was reading this actually the other day, Sweden being mask-free, they're close to 0 fatalities daily. Their chief epidemiologist was playing down some of the fears of the Delta variant. They said that they had maybe like 1 coronavirus fatality per day. Everyone kind of brings up Sweden and cites them as, well, they didn't force everyone to shut down. They didn't force everyone into masks. Is there something else that could play into it? Because I would just think those results could be replicated if everyone followed that same thing, but I'm not sure that is the case in a number of states, and then comparing that with Sweden, et cetera. What are your thoughts about that data?
Well, I think that the far northern latitudes like Sweden seem to have a single season in the winter. They don't have kind of what we have in the U.S., which is sort of this double season where we have both a winter season and a summer season. So There are a lot of complex factors that go into the seasonality of viruses. It's not very well understood. It has to do with things like temperature and humidity, but also potentially solar radiation, which is why you get different patterns at different latitudes, and obviously behavior as well. People being inside when it's air conditioned and that kind of thing. So, I don't know why Sweden doesn't have any summer activity with this virus. The really interesting question is going to be what their winter looks like this year, and if they have another bad winter wave like they did last year. And I'm not sure anyone has the answer to that, but I do think that the approach that they've had, which is similar to Florida, in that they haven't panicked, they haven't locked things down, they've gone on with life and had society operate, hasn't led to any higher deaths than anywhere else. All the places are more or less in the same range, but it has led to a lot more happiness, if you believe the polling, and a lot better economic outcomes compared to the countries that were shutting things down.
Phil, I know that there are other variants out there. There's the Lambda variant, and I know there's probably going to be even variants after this that the United States is going to have to deal with. I mean, it's a virus, and we're just going to have to acclimate to it. What do you make of and I know that there's some scientists and some researchers say that the quickness with which we moved to get everyone to implement the vaccination rollout, that whole process, is that a factor? I mean, I know that some are saying it, not a lot, but there's some out there in science and in medical profession that are saying that that can actually encourage mutations, and that contributes to some of these lesser contagious and lesser virulent variants. Is that, I mean, what do you put truth in that? I mean, what is your take on that?
I'm kind of skeptical of both sides of that. I don't think that having lots of people who are not vaccinated makes particular mutations and variants more likely, and I don't think that having too many people vaccinated does either. And I'll tell you why I don't think either of those theories holds a lot of water, and that is this is a zoonotic virus. This thing is jumping between almost every mammal species on the planet. The USDA just did a study. They found 33% of white-tailed deer in the United States test positive for antibodies. That means they've had this virus. We know that it was in mink in Europe. We know that it's been in bats. And so I just think, there are going to be lots of reservoirs out there. Viruses continue to change. That's kind of the story of the world forever. The good news is when you have a virus that's much, much more dangerous than the average virus, like this one, almost all mutations are going to make it less dangerous, not more, just because of reversion to the mean and the fact that when you have an outlier that you're starting with, you're probably going to be moving in the direction of a more typical virus almost every time. And so I think that's the optimistic case. That's the reason to be optimistic about new variants. The other thing is that this is a relatively simple virus. It's not like flu, which can combine in an almost infinite number of ways. And so I think we're going to start to reach kind of the terminal point of mutation where we've kind of seen all the different mutations that can arise that are clinically significant, and you're going to start to see repeats and just independently the same things arising that we've already seen before, and we're already starting to see that with some of these mutations.
And to be clear, too, we're still talking with Phil Kerpen. We're still too early, I think, into this to be able to make a prediction as to if it's going to be seasonal or not, or how that would look.
Well, I think that it's almost certainly going to be seasonal. All of the other coronaviruses are. The interesting thing to me, though, is the other coronaviruses are all sort of winter, spring seasonal. And this one, we seem to have this double pattern where we're getting it in the summer in the lower latitudes. And kind of we're getting more of a classic seasonal pattern in the northern latitudes. And the question is, will that settle into an annual thing, or will the summer season kind of disappear as population immunity gets stronger? And I'll tell you, I do really think that from a political standpoint, this double season is the worst thing we could ever have.